Hey everyone, this video is a continuation of our discussion of Mill's utilitarianism. In this video, we're going to discuss two things. First, we're going to discuss the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And the second thing that we're going to discuss is an early objection to utilitarianism that Mill tries to address in his text. The following video will consider two more, I think, more substantial objections to utilitarianism. So let's go. So many people, when they learn about utilitarianism, and this was the case in just around Mill's time too, people started to realize, look, Mill, isn't this whole idea that whenever you have a moral decision to make, whenever you need to decide if you need to do A or B, should I steal, should I not steal, should I lie, should I not lie? Whenever you have a decision to make like this, isn't it kind of like cumbersome to sit down and have to do like a utilitarian calculus to sit down and try to reason out the costs and the benefits of the various choices that you might make? As if you're like, going to the corner store and you come across a Snickers bar and you realize you forgot your wallet. And you're like, I could steal the Snickers bar. But wait, let me do a utilitarian calculus. And you like get out a pen and paper and you're like sitting down on the ground, like scribbling out, what are the pros? What are the costs? Who's affected? That just seems like kind of ridiculous to a lot of people that every time you have a decision to make that affects others, that you would have to do a utilitarian calculus. So Mill during his time did not make the distinction that I'm about to introduce, but utilitarians coming after Mill, people in the same tradition, did make the distinction on his behalf. I apologize. I'm kind of giggling because my dog is just going absolutely bonkers on a toy under the table. So if you hear snuffling or hear tearing sounds, that is him ripping apart one of his toys. Anyway, let's continue. So, he's squeaking. Okay, so utilitarians made a distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism as a way of kind of supporting Mill and making utilitarianism seem a little bit more palatable or a little bit more reasonable. So on the one hand, you have act utilitarianism. And I should say, most people who are aware of this distinction and employ this distinction are not act utilitarians, they're rule utilitarians. So act utilitarianism is the idea that whenever you have a decision to make, you should sit down and do a utilitarian calculus, right? That you should be like figuring out the pros and the cons and the costs and the benefits and who's going to be affected and, trying to reason this all out kind of like mathematically, as it were. So that would be act utilitarianism. The word I'm just saying is act, A-C-T, act utilitarianism. So the idea is you do utilitarian calculus, and that applies to specific actions that you might make. So if you're going to cheat, if you're going to take whatever, if you're going to, you're trying to decide if you should tell a white lie in a particular circumstance, the idea is you can do a cost-benefit analysis to figure out what the moral choice would be. But many people, as I say, who have employed this distinction actually are followers of rule utilitarianism, rule, R-U-L-E. And so the idea is with rule utilitarianism that the kind of cost-benefit analysis that you're supposed to apply doesn't apply to individual choices, because that would just be too cumbersome. Like you'd have to be doing all these kind of, cost-benefit analyses like all the time whenever you have a moral decision to make, and that's just too much. So what they say is that the cost-benefit analysis should be applied not to actions, but to the rules of society, right? So the idea is societies are governed by like laws. They're governed by rules. Is stealing allowed? Is it illegal? Is it legal? Should we allow people to lie? Should we not allow people to lie? Should we allow people to murder or not murder? Should we have capital punishment? Should we not have capital punishment? Should we allow divorce? Should we not allow divorce? Gun ownership? I'm just going to list all of the all of the things that we might legislate. We're going to be here for a while. No, but whatever, representative sample. So the idea is, well, do we want to outlaw stealing, for example? So then you would do utilitarian calculus. But it's not about particular individuals. You're not considering their particular choices in their particular context. You're thinking about like the society as a whole. So you can imagine like two societies, as it were, one in which lying is illegal, stealing. One in which stealing is illegal, and one in which stealing is not illegal. And then you would do a cost-benefit analysis for each. Which society would be happier? The one that makes stealing illegal, or the one that allows it to be legal? Same thing with like abortion. You would just, again, you're not thinking about like this particular person, should they have an abortion, or this particular person, should we, use capital punishment on them? Should we execute this particular criminal? You're not doing that. You're thinking about like, should we allow capital punishment in our society, right? So you're thinking about the rules of society. under rule utilitarianism. And so then you would try to figure out, which, should we allow capital punishment? We compare a society which has capital punishment, and we compare our society if it didn't have capital punishment, and we try to see which one would produce the greatest amount of happiness for all people affected. So it's still the same basic principle. You're just not applying it to actions. You're applying it to rules and laws. Right? So if you think that that's the way that utilitarianism ought to work, then that would make you a rule utilitarian. So the idea is in a rule utilitarian society, you pretty much just, assuming that it's like a good society, that it's like what some philosophers will call well-ordered, then you would basically just be okay following the laws. Like if you're in Wawa and you're thinking about, like, should I steal this or something like that? No, it's illegal. And so you shouldn't do it. You don't need to do like utilitarian calculus because that's done at the level of rules. It's kind of the basic idea. So under rule utilitarianism, you pretty much would, as an individual, as a citizen, you can just get along with kind of like following the rules of society, assuming that it's a good society. And then there would be specific circumstances where you would want to do specific, calculations. You'd want to employ the calculations. For example, like if you are thinking about changing the laws. So if you're like a legislator and you're trying to figure out what the laws should be, then of course you're going to have to be doing these kind of calculus. Should we allow capital punishment? Should we not have capital punishment? Should we allow abortion or not? These kinds of things. So if you're in the process of making the laws, you'll have to make a decision. Do a concrete utilitarian calculus. But some rule utilitarians will say there are also situations in which your moral intuitions will conflict, or the moral laws, as it were, will conflict. So that in our society, it's not like illegal, but it's customary to there is a kind of moral prohibition on lying because we think that Mill would say that's because it makes society happier when people tell the truth. But then you also know that you should, be kind to people or something like that, right? In those kinds of situations, you have you might be able to envision a situation where the one moral rule will tell you to do one thing and another moral rule will tell you to do another thing. Like if somebody, your best friend comes down in an outfit that just looks horrible and asks you, this is me every morning. No, I'm like, Leo, my dog, does this look good? And they ask you, does this look good on me, or is this flattering? You're like, in general, you should tell the truth because that's like the norm in society. That's the rule of society. But then you also know that you should, protect people's feelings. In a situation like that, you can't really quite follow the rules because the rules conflict. And so in that case, you might have to do a utilitarian calculus. But the basic idea is if you live in a good society, they should be doing this at the level of rules. And so then what you should, pretty much your obligation as a citizen is just to follow the rules, assuming that it's a good society. Cool. So that's a basic distinction between act and rule utilitarianism. Now, second part of the video, we're going to have a brief discussion of one of my favorite objections to utilitarianism because it leads Mill to do some interesting philosophical work. So an early objection to utilitarianism, one that Mill considers in the text of utilitarianism, came from people who, as Mill puts it, think that utilitarianism is a moral doctrine which is only fit for swine. Only fit for swine. That is, only fit for pigs. People don't use the word swine anymore, which is too bad. I think it's a good word. But in any case, some people objected to utilitarianism because they say, look, Mill, this is a moral doctrine that's only fit for pigs, man. Like, look, you're thinking about like the big ethical questions. Should murder, lying, stealing, are these things right? Are they wrong? How should we arrange our society? You're thinking like big, heavy, ethical questions. And basically you're like, you, Mill, what you're saying is the way that we should decide these big, heavy philosophical and ethical questions is we should figure out what gives people the most amount of pleasure as opposed to pain. That is what Mill says, right? And he says that an action is right or a law or a policy is right if it produces the greatest amount of happiness in society. And then he says, well, what is happiness? Happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain. That's all that it is. So being a moral person is essentially minimizing pain and maximizing pleasure. And people were saying to Mill, that's how pigs think. Pigs think about pleasure. They just think about mud and food and sex and things like that. Do they think about sex? I don't know if they think about sex. Doesn't matter. The point is, all that they care about is pleasure. Human beings, we're supposed to be higher than that. We're supposed to be greater than that. We're supposed to be thinking about ethical ideals and all this kind of stuff, Mill. And you're saying that all that ethics is the kind of stuff that pigs care about. And so Mill responds to this one. I think he raises his objection to himself because he thinks it would be fun to respond to, basically. But I think his response is actually kind of fun. I agree with him. I think it's kind of fun. So this is what he writes. So I'm just going to read a short passage from Utilitarianism. So I'll be looking down a little bit. But he writes, when thus attacked, the Epicureans, which he claims, this is a school of thought that he claims was actually a kind of utilitarianism back in the day, back in ancient Greece. And so he says, when people made this objection to Epicureans, when thus attacked, the Epicureans have always answered that it is not they, but their accusers who represent human nature in a degrading light, since the accusation supposes human beings to be capable of no pleasures except those of which swine are capable. If this supposition were true, the charge could not be gainsaid, but would then no longer be an imputation. For if the sources of pleasure were precisely the same to human beings and to swine, the rule of life, which is good enough for the one, would be good enough for the other. The comparison of the Epicurean life, the utilitarian life, to that of beasts is felt as degrading precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, they do not regard anything as happiness, which does not include their gratification. That's crystal clear, right? Moving on. What the hell does that mean? No, so I love this passage. So what he's saying is like, look, since time immemorial, people have accused utilitarians of having a moral doctrine that's only fit for swine. And the idea is that, that's kind of like, isn't that degrading? Mill, like utilitarianism, aren't you comparing, you're basically saying that human beings are only fit to be pigs. Yeah, we have the same kind of morality. And Mill says, hey, look, I'm not the one who's saying that human beings are piggish. You're the one who are saying that human beings are piggish. Because I recognize that human beings are capable of pleasures and happinesses that pigs have no conception of. If you think that my doctrine makes human beings into pigs, that's because you don't understand what human beings, the kinds of happiness that human beings are capable of, and you think that human beings are basically pigs. Yeah, did you catch that? He does this kind of like philosophical jujitsu. They are accusing him of making human beings into pigs and saying that ethics is really nothing but the ethics of pigs. And he's saying, I'm not the person that's saying that human beings are piggish. You are, because you assume that the only pleasures that human beings are capable of are the same pleasures that pigs are capable of, like food, sex, rolling in mud. I don't know. Some people maybe enjoy a good roll in the mud. Hypothetically. Isn't that what they do at spas? Come on. All right, doesn't matter. So he is saying, I recognize that human beings are capable of all sorts of kinds of higher pleasures. You apparently are not aware of that. You think that the only pleasures that human beings are capable of as sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's, to update it to the 1960s. Okay, so there's more to this. So Mill basically goes on and introduces a distinction between what we can call bodily pleasures and mental pleasures. Yeah, bodily pleasures and mental pleasures. So bodily pleasures, I think, are pretty obvious. Yeah, sex, drugs, rock and roll. But yeah, food, things like that. Having a nap in the afternoon. No, I know some of you are like, yes, tell me more about that. Love naps. Food, sex, a massage, these kinds of things, like a physical, just, a massage. Other kinds of things, I don't know. Massages and food are pretty good. But there's all kinds of just like physical pleasure, drinking tea, drinking a beer, all of these kinds of things would be part of, physical pleasures. So you can pause the video for a couple minutes and just think about, physical pleasures. What makes your body just like literally feel good? Maybe it's meditation makes you feel good. Maybe wrapping yourself up in a warm blanket on a cold day makes you feel good. These are, these would be like physical pleasures. Right. And so he acknowledges that human beings are capable of physical pleasures, and those are important. Right. It's, you can get pleasure from if you're really dehydrated. I'm kind of thirsty right now. If I were to drink a glass of water, like that would give me pleasure. That's a bodily pleasure. Interestingly, though, that water doesn't really give you pleasure unless you're thirsty. Have you ever realized that? You're just like, you know what I could really go for right now? Water. Like, no, not unless you're thirsty. One of you out there is probably like, actually, I like drinking water no matter what. That probably means you're anemic. You should probably go to the doctor. Okay. So bodily pleasures, those I think are pretty straightforward. Then you also have mental pleasures. So mental pleasures would be like, and again, I would invite you to think of more of these, but mental pleasures would be like, I don't know, reading poetry. If you're into poetry, that might give you pleasure. You'd enjoy that. Reading a book, completing a college course and getting a good grade. You have a kind of like satisfaction in that. That would be a kind of mental pleasure. Working on a hard math problem and then getting a solution. You'd feel like, oh, yes, I finally got it, right? That would be a kind of mental pleasure, right? So he makes this basic distinction between mental pleasures and bodily pleasures. There's an interesting kind of like what philosophers would call liminal cases, in between cases, like, sex, obviously a bodily pleasure. But what about like being in love? Is that a mental pleasure or is that a physical pleasure? I think that's kind of an interesting question. Animals obviously have can have the pleasures of sex. I don't know that they fall in love, which is interesting. So that, might make you think that it's maybe more of a kind of a mental pleasure. Friendship, right? That's another thing that human beings experience. Sharing a common interest with somebody, right? Where you find somebody who loves, whatever, something weird about that you like. You like watching like 1930s silent films or reading, 17th century French poetry, or I don't know what it is people do. And you find somebody else who shares that, deep-seated interest of yours, and you share that, and that kind of forms your friendship. That is also a kind of pleasure. I think that Mill would say that that's probably a kind of a mental pleasure. That's kind of like a cerebral kind of thing. He acknowledges, I think he would acknowledge that mental pleasures and bodily pleasures are not like completely, independent of one another. I think he would say, for example, you can become a connoisseur of various things. You can become a person who is a connoisseur of music, a person of discriminating tastes, as people used to say, in which case you can enjoy music at kind of like an intellectual level, but you can also enjoy music at a kind of physical level, like it makes you feel a certain way. If you've been to a concert or something like that, you can even like feel the bass in your chest and stuff like that, and that can even physically kind of feel good. So these are not totally independent distinctions, but I think the distinction is like tolerably clear. Some things are kind of more cerebral; they're more in the mental pleasures, and some things are very clearly physical pleasures, even though there's some things that maybe combine them or overlap. Okay, so Mill goes further than this. He doesn't just make the distinction between mental pleasures and bodily pleasures. He goes so far as to say that he thinks that mental pleasures are superior to bodily pleasures. And there's much more that could be said about this. We could spend, a ton of time on it. Please don't. We won't. We're almost done. But Mill would say he believes that mental pleasures are better than bodily pleasures. For one thing, bodily pleasures tend to be mixed. They tend to not be pure pleasures. So, for example, if you come home from, school or something like that, and you find out that there's like ice cream in the freezer or something, and so you're like, I could really go for some ice cream. So you do a bunch of ice cream, and you're like, oh, that was delicious. And then as soon as you're done, you're like, I hate myself, right? You're like, crap. No, I just totally blew my diet. I should work out. So you have this experience of pleasure, and then afterwards you're like, damn it, right? So it's mixed. It is pleasure mixed with pain, right? Bodily pleasures tend to be a combination of those. They tend not to be pure pleasures. Even going for a run. Some people find pleasure in that. Most people are weird. Let's just be honest. But some people enjoy going for runs and things like that. But that's also kind of like a mixture of pain and pleasure. It's not pure pleasure. Whereas mental pleasures, he says, tend to be more pure. So you don't have if you learn to speak French or something, that's like a kind of mental pleasure. You take, you learn to speak French and you're like, wow, I learned to speak French. I've never met anybody. Maybe there is somebody who's like, damn it, I really wish that I hadn't learned to speak French. It causes them pain afterwards. They're just like, what is wrong with me? How could I have done that? No, people do that when they eat 4 donuts when they only need to eat 1. They tend not to do that when they learn to speak Italian or something. I really shouldn't have read that book. If you took pleasure in it, it doesn't make it's weird. I don't know. So mental pleasures tend to be more pure. They also tend to be fecund, which I think is interesting. He says this is a word that nobody uses anymore, but I like it. Fecund. F-E-C-U-N-D. Fecund. Look it up. Basically what it means is that he says that mental pleasures tend to give rise to more pleasures of the same, right? Whereas if you eat a piece of cake or something, bodily pleasures are not fecund. You eat the cake and then you're just like, that's over, it's done. But if you learn to speak French, that opens the doors to all sorts of other kinds of pleasures. Now you can read French literature. You can go to France, I guess. You can try to pick up French people. I don't know what people do with other languages. It doesn't matter. The point is it opens the doors to other things. If you learn mathematics, that opens the doors to other things. If you learn to read, my goodness, that obviously opens the doors to all sorts of other kinds of pleasures, right? So they tend to be fecund. They tend not to be one and done. They tend to give rise to other pleasures, right? So he actually has fairly sophisticated arguments, and he can go on in this vein for thinking that mental pleasures are actually superior to bodily pleasures. The question, and if we were in the classroom, we'd spend the rest of the time practically talking about this, is, do you agree with him? Do you think that mental pleasures are better than bodily pleasures? I guess I'll just have a discussion with myself since you're not here. No, But you can think about that. Which would you find more preferable, right? One way to think about this is like, would you rather be a pig, to go back to the pig thing, would you rather be a pig and have your fill of bodily pleasures, or rather be a human being who is kind of dissatisfied, but is capable of the kinds of pleasures of a human being, capable of romantic love, capable of friendship, capable of learning languages, all this kind of stuff? And Mill thinks that a person would actually, a person who is fluent, he says, this is a crucial qualification. He says a person who is fluent in both kinds of pleasures, in bodily pleasures and in mental pleasures, a person who is competent, I think that's literally the word that he uses, who is a competent judge, a person who has had experience with bodily pleasures and mental pleasures, that person would rather be a human being, even a human being who's dissatisfied, but would rather have the capacity for romantic love and these kinds of things, rather than being a pig, he says, right? So he thinks that human beings, they kind of value, they take pleasure even in having the capacity for various kinds of pleasures, even if, like, they would rather have the capacity for friendship, even if they don't have any friends. Sounds like a personal thing now. No, they would rather have the capacity for romantic love, even if they don't have romantic love, rather than just be a pig with their fill of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know, the pigs, they love their rock and roll. So I've been told. Okay, so Mill thinks that anybody who is a competent judge, and again, here you might wonder if he's kind of stacking the deck, which is to say if he's like, you know, tilting the game in his own favor. Because I suspect if I were to ask you all in the room that maybe the majority of you would pick bodily pleasures over mental pleasures as being superior. And so you might think that Mill's kind of cheating, right? He's kind of like stacking the deck, you know, cheating in cards. By saying competent judges, because if you ask him, okay, Mill, what would be a competent judge? I don't think he's going to be like, oh, it's a frat boy, you know, somebody who like gets wasted every weekend. I think it's going to be somebody like him. I think he's going to think of somebody who's a competent judge as being something like a philosopher, right, who likes reading and stuff. And it's like, yeah, but are you cheating? I think that's an interesting thing to think about. But in any case, Mill says if you have a competent judge, they're going to prefer mental pleasures to bodily pleasures. And so I'm even going to read this brief passage because this is his. Again, he's sometimes really difficult to read, but sometimes he has these passages which are really brilliant. They're kind of like difficult to decode, but once you decode them, they're like, yeah, man, dude, that's really effing smart. So this, by way of ending this video, we'll see how he wraps this up. He says, going back to this kind of example that I offered, would you rather be a pig with your fill of piggy pleasures, of, you know, bodily pleasures, or would you rather be a human being, even if you're dissatisfied? And he talks about he would rather be Socrates, who's a famous Greek philosopher, considered to be the first philosopher in the Western tradition. He says you would rather be, most people would rather be, he thinks, would rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, is what he says. You'd rather be a person who doesn't even have all the pleasures they're capable of, but is at least capable of friendship and romantic love and reading and languages and all this kind of stuff. They would rather be that than a pig. So this is what he says. It is indisputable that the being whose capacities of enjoyment are low has the greatest chance of having them fully satisfied. The pig has very low capacity for pleasure, and so it's pretty easy for them to be fulfilled. And he says a highly endowed being, like a philosopher, Socrates, a highly endowed being will always feel that any happiness which he can look for, as the world is constituted, is imperfect. And you might wonder here if Mill's kind of talking about himself, because he was this kind of tortured genius. He continues. But the highly endowed being can learn to bear life's imperfections if they are at all bearable, and they will not make him envy the being who is indeed unconscious of the imperfections, but only because he feels not at all the good which those imperfections qualify. And this is the famous passage. He says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides." All right, come on, that's like pretty effing brilliant. Even if you think that he's wrong, that's like rhetorical flourish. That's some awesome writing, right? So he says, yeah, so a pig might be satisfied and the human being might be dissatisfied, but anybody in their right mind would rather be the human being dissatisfied than the pig satisfied, because they can understand both sides of the question, whereas the pig can't even understand anything at all, basically. All right, so that's it for today. Have a lovely day, and I will see you next time.